Sweat glistened on John's bare chest as he pressed Jake against the wall of the darkened garage, lips crashing with a hunger that bordered on violence. The air was thick with the musk of motor oil, and their mingled breaths, a stolen moment beneath the hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed like a trapped insect overhead. Jake's hands clawed at John's back, nails digging into the taut skin, leaving red trails that burned with a desperate plea neither dared to voice. The garage was their sanctuary, a shadowed refuge where the world outside, its judgments, its dangers, its suffocating expectations, couldn't reach them. The walls were lined with tools, their metallic edges glinting faintly in the dim light, a silent audience to their reckless collision. The faint scent of gasoline lingered in the air, sharp and intoxicating, mingling with the raw heat radiating from their bodies pressed too close, too urgent. John's hands roamed Jake's sides, fingers gripping hard enough to bruise, as if he could anchor them both in this fleeting pocket of time. Jake's breath hitched, a ragged sound swallowed by the press of John's mouth, their kiss a tangle of need and defiance. The world beyond the garage was a distant hum, a low, ominous drone of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. But here, it was just them. The scrape of concrete under their boots, the creak of the workbench as John shoved Jake harder against the wall. For a moment, it was perfect. The taste of salt on John's lips, the roughness of his stubble against Jake's jaw, the way their bodies fit together like pieces of a puzzle no one else could solve. But perfection was a lie, and the night outside pulsed with danger. Rifles cocked, boots scuffing gravel, a plan spiraling into chaos like a wildfire eating through dry brush. The heist had been Claudia's brainchild, born in the smoky haze of a dive bar 3 weeks ago, her sharp eyes glinting with ambition as she'd laid out the details over a crumpled map and a bottle of cheap whiskey. She'd wanted the Sullivan estate, old money, older grudges, and a safe stuffed with cash and secrets. John had been the one to suggest the garage as the entry point, his voice steady as he'd traced the estate's layout with a calloused finger. He knew it better than anyone, having spent countless nights there with Jake, their secret rendezvous cloaked under the flimsy guise of friendship. Stolen glances over beers in the Sullivan kitchen, hands brushing under the hood of a car, nights that stretched too long and ended too soon. They'd built something fragile here, something the world wasn't ready to see. Tonight, though, the garage wasn't a sanctuary, it was a battleground, a ticking clock counting down to disaster. The air outside crackled with tension, the faint rustle of leaves masking the approach of Claudia's crew. 5 of them, armed and restless, their loyalty as thin as the ice they walked on. John had felt the shift earlier, the way Claudia's smile had turned brittle when he'd questioned her plan, the way her boyfriend Marcus had flexed his knuckles like he was itching for a fight. But John hadn't backed down, he never did. Not for Claudia, not for anyone, except Jake. A gunshot shattered the stillness, splintering the garage window into a jagged maw of glass that glittered like broken teeth in the faint moonlight. Jake flinched, his body jerking against John's, eyes wide with a fear that cut through the haze of their desire. John gripped his face, rough palms framing Jake's cheeks, forcing their gazes to lock. "Stay with me," he rasped, voice a growl of lust and fury, before kissing him again, deeper, as if the world could burn to ash and he'd still claim this moment. The kiss was fierce, desperate, a collision of lips and teeth that tasted of blood and salt, a vow unspoken between them, of love and loss, of a bond that neither could fully sever, no matter how hard they tried. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, a wild drumbeat torn between the heat of John's body and the cold reality of the danger closing in. Another shot rang out, closer now, the sound ricocheting off the estate's stone walls and slicing through the night like a blade. Claudia's voice followed, sharp and unhinged, cutting through the chaos. "Where's the money, you bastard? I'll bleed it out of you." Her words a venomous promise. Jake shoved John back, chest heaving, his hands trembling as they fell from John's shoulders. "They're inside," he hissed, voice breaking on the edge of panic. John's jaw tightened, a storm brewing in his dark eyes, and he turned to the workbench, snatching a wrench from the clutter of tools. His knuckles whitened around the cold metal, the weight of it grounding him as the garage door rattled violently, something, slamming against it with a force that shook the walls. The The world exploded into screams and gunfire, a cacophony that drowned out the hum of the bulb overhead. "From the house?" Jake's father bellowed, his voice a marine's roar of defiance. "Get the hell off my land!" The sound carrying the weight of a man who'd faced death before and laughed in its face. Claudia's answering cackle was wild and wicked, a banshee's cry that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. John lunged toward the chaos, his silhouette framed briefly against the flickering light before he disappeared into the fray, leaving Jake frozen in place. The taste of John lingered on his lips, searing and bitter, as the night unraveled into a symphony of betrayal and death. Jake's legs felt like lead, rooted to the concrete floor as the sounds of violence bled through the walls. Grunts, curses, the sickening crunch of bone meeting steel. He could picture it. John swinging that wrench like a weapon, his broad shoulders cutting through the intruders like a force of nature. Claudia with her pistol drawn, her platinum hair a tangle of fury as she barked orders. Marcus looming behind her, his hulking frame a promise of brutality. And somewhere in the house, Jake's father, Thomas Sullivan, fighting back with whatever he could grab, his military training kicking in despite the years of rust. The garage door buckled inward with a deafening groan, metal twisting under the weight of a shoulder, and Jake snapped out of his stupor. He stumbled to the workbench, hands shaking as he fumbled for something, anything, to defend himself. His fingers closed around a screwdriver, its handle slick with sweat, and he clutched it like a lifeline. The door gave way with a final crash, and Marcus barreled through, his eyes glinting with a manic edge. Blood streaked his cheek, a fresh cut from some unseen skirmish, and he grinned when he saw Jake, a predator sizing up prey. "Well, well," Marcus drawled, his voice a low rumble as he cracked his knuckles. "The pretty boy's still here. Where's your boyfriend, huh? Left you to die?" Jake's throat tightened, but he raised the screwdriver, its point trembling in the air. "Get out," he spat, the words more bravado than he felt. Marcus laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls, and lunged forward, his meaty hands swatting the makeshift weapon aside like it was nothing. The screwdriver clattered to the floor, skittering under the workbench, and Marcus grabbed Jake by the collar, slamming him back against the wall with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. "You're gonna tell me where the safe is?" Marcus growled, his breath hot and sour against Jake's face. "Or I'll carve it out of you." Before Jake could answer, a shadow loomed behind Marcus. John, wrench raised high, his face a mask of rage. The tool came down with a sickening thud, connecting with Marcus's skull, and the big man crumpled to the floor, a puppet with its strings cut. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and viscous, spreading across the concrete like spilled ink. John's chest heaved, his eyes wild as he met Jake's gaze, a silent question hanging between them. "Are you okay?" Jake nodded, shaky and breathless, but there was no time for relief. Gunfire erupted from the house again, closer now, and Claudia's voice screeched over the din. "John, you traitor! You're dead!" Her words dripping with venom. John grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the shattered window. "We've got to move," he said, his voice rough but steady. "She's lost it." They scrambled through the jagged opening, glass slicing at their skin as they tumbled into the cool night air. The estate grounds stretched out before them, a maze of manicured hedges and gravel paths illuminated by the faint glow of security lights. The house loomed to their right, its windows flashing with muzzle flares, a war zone where Thomas Sullivan held his ground against Claudia's dwindling crew. Jake's stomach twisted. His father didn't know about the heist, didn't know John had brought this hell to their doorstep. The betrayal stung deeper than any bullet could. John dragged Jake behind a row of shrubs, their breaths coming in sharp bursts as they crouched low. "She'll come for us," John muttered, peering through the leaves. "She won't stop till she gets the money. Or us." "Why'd you do it?" Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "Why'd you bring her here?" John's eyes darkened, a flicker of guilt cutting through the storm. "I thought I could control it," he admitted, his hand tightening on the wrench. "Thought we could get out clean, start over somewhere, together. I didn't know she'd go this far." Jake wanted to scream, to shove John away and run, but the truth anchored him. He'd known something was off, had seen the tension in John's shoulders these past weeks, and he'd stayed silent. This was on both of them. A figure emerged from the garage. Claudia, her pistol gleaming in the moonlight, her face twisted with fury. She scanned the grounds, her movements jerky, unhinged, and then her gaze locked on the shrubs. "I see you, Johnny," she sang, her voice a mockery of sweetness. "You and your little lover boy can't hide forever." John tensed, ready to spring, but Jake grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait," he hissed. "We need a plan." "There's no time," John shot back, but before he could move, a roar split the night. Thomas Sullivan, charging from the house with a shotgun in hand, his face a mask of righteous fury. Claudia whirled, firing wildly, and the old man ducked behind a stone fountain, returning fire with a blast that echoed through the estate. The distraction was their chance. John yanked Jake to his feet, and they bolted toward the tree line at the edge of the property, branches clawing at their skin as they ran. Behind them, the gunfire grew sporadic, punctuated by Claudia's shrieks and Thomas's bellows, a deadly duet that faded as the woods swallowed them whole. They didn't stop until the sounds of chaos were a distant murmur, collapsing against a gnarled oak, their breaths ragged in the stillness. John's hand found Jake's, fingers lacing together, sticky with sweat and blood. "I'm sorry," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fucked this up." Jake looked at him, at the man he'd loved in secret for years, the man who'd just torn his world apart. "Yeah," he said, his throat tight. "You did." But he didn't pull his hand away, not yet. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of what they'd lost and what they might still salvage from the wreckage. The air shifted, heavy with smoke and the metallic tang of blood, a miasma that clung to the lungs like damp rot. Inside the sprawling Sullivan mansion, Claudia stood over Jake's father, her rifle barrel pressed to his temple, with a steadiness that belied the madness flickering in her pale blue eyes. Daniel Sullivan sat rigid in a high-backed chair, wrists straining against the coarse ropes binding him, veins bulging beneath weathered skin that bore the scars of a life hard-earned. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding audibly, a Marine's defiance etched into every line of his face. Beside him, his wife Margaret whimpered through a gag fashioned from a silk scarf, mascara streaking her cheeks in black rivulets, her trembling hands clutching the armrests as if they could anchor her to a reality slipping away. The heist crew. 5 masked figures with twitchy fingers and hollow eyes tore through the room like scavengers, upending drawers, splintering furniture, their shouts a cacophony of greed that drowned out the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The mansion, once a gleaming symbol of Daniel Sullivan's success, built brick by brick from a fortune in shipping and steel, was now a war zone, its marble floors smeared with blood, its walls echoing with screams and the crash of shattered porcelain. Claudia's platinum hair hung in wild strands, framing a face twisted with a cocktail of rage and exhilaration. She pressed the rifle harder against Daniel's temple, the cold steel leaving a faint indent in his skin. "Where's the safe, old man?" she hissed, her voice a serrated edge. "You think I won't paint this room with your brains? Tell me, or she's next." She jerked her head toward Margaret, whose muffled sob broke the air like glass. Daniel's eyes narrowed, a spark of fury igniting behind them, but he said nothing, his silence a wall she couldn't breach. Not yet. Outside, the night was a shroud. The estate's manicured lawn swallowed by shadows cast by towering oaks. The faint hum of crickets had been replaced by the crunch of gravel under boots, the click of rifle safeties being flicked off, the low growl of a plan unraveling. The heist had been John's idea. At least that's what he'd told himself when he pitched to Claudia 3 weeks ago in the dim light of a bar on the edge of town. He'd sketched the layout of the Sullivan estate on a napkin, his finger tracing the back entrance through the garage, the kitchen door that never locked properly, the hallway leading to Daniel's study, where the safe was hidden behind a false panel. He'd known the place like the back of his hand. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow where he'd once stood with Jake, their breaths mingling in secret. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about Jake. About the way he'd turned away from John 2 nights ago, his voice cold as he'd said, "It's done." The rejection had festered, a wound John couldn't cauterize, and the heist had become his revenge, a way to tear down the world Jake clung to make him feel the same hollow ache. Now, as John burst through the back door, wrench still clutched in his hand, The reality of what he'd unleashed hit him like a fist to the gut. The kitchen lay in ruins. Cabinets flung open, a shattered bottle of bourbon pooling on the counter, its sharp scent cutting through the haze of smoke. He stepped into the main hall, boots crunching over broken glass, and froze at the sight before him. Daniel bound and defiant, Margaret trembling, Claudia looming like a vengeful specter, and the crew tearing apart the life he'd once envied. His eyes blazed with a fury that had simmered since Jake's words, but beneath it, a pang of regret gnawed at him, sharp and unexpected. This wasn't what he'd wanted. Not this chaos, not this violence. He'd wanted to hurt Jake, to carve his name into the wreckage of his perfect life. But now, standing in the eye of the storm, he wondered if he'd gone too far, if the price of his anger was a debt he couldn't pay. The crew barely noticed him, their masks slick with sweat as they rifled through the study, pulling books from shelves, slashing cushions with switchblades. One of them, Marcus, John recognized by his hulking frame, kicked over an antique globe, the wood splintering as it crashed to the floor. "It's got to be here somewhere," Marcus bellowed, his voice muffled by the black fabric over his face. "Check the walls. Pry 'em open if you have to." Another figure, slighter, with jittery hands, dragged a crowbar across a painting of the Sullivan family. Daniel, Margaret, and a younger Jake, smiling in a world that no longer existed, tearing the canvas to ribbons. John's grip tightened on the wrench, the cold metal grounding him as his mind raced. He could still stop this, he told himself. He could pull Claudia back, call off the dogs, walk away before the blood ran too deep. But before he could move, the front door slammed open, and Jake stumbled in, hair plastered with sweat from a late-night bike ride, his chest heaving under a damp t-shirt. He froze in the threshold, eyes wide as they took in the tableau, his parents gagged and bound, Claudia's rifle gleaming under the chandelier's fractured light. John caught in the fray, like a ghost from a nightmare he couldn't wake from. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, John's dark with guilt and fury, Jake's bright with shock and betrayal. Then Jake bolted, his sneakers squeaking against the marble as he veered toward the kitchen. John lunged after him, wrench raised, but Jake was faster, driven by a primal surge of adrenaline. He reached the counter, hands snatching knives from the wooden block, their blades glinting like shards of his shattered life. He turned, chest heaving, and hurled the first knife with a precision born of desperation, years of tossing darts in the garage with John honed into a deadly instinct. The blade struck John's shoulder, sinking deep into muscle, and blood bloomed red against his gray shirt, a vivid stain that spread like ink on parchment. John staggered, a gasp ripping from his throat as pain flared white-hot down his arm. The wrench slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor, and he clutched the wound, disbelief etched across his face. "Jake?" he choked out, but the word was lost as Claudia spun, her rifle barking in her hands. Bullets tore through John's chest, 1, 2, 3. Each shot a thunderclap that reverberated through the mansion, punching holes in his torso with brutal efficiency. He crumpled, knees buckling, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. His eyes locked on Jake's in a final, anguished plea. Forgiveness, understanding, something he'd never find, before the light in them flickered and died. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the wail of distant sirens piercing the night. Jake stood frozen, the second knife still clenched in his hand, its blade trembling as his breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. Blood dripped from John's body, pooling around him, the coppery scent mingling with the bourbon and smoke. Claudia lowered her rifle, her chest heaving, a wild grin splitting her face as she turned back to Daniel. "That's what happens when you cross me," she spat, jabbing the barrel against his forehead again. "Now talk, or your boy's next." Daniel's eyes flicked to Jake, a storm of rage and sorrow brewing behind them, but he held his tongue, his silence a shield and a challenge. Margaret's sobs grew louder, her gag slipping as she choked out. "Please, just stop. Take what you want." Claudia backhanded her, the crack of skin on skin sharp in the stillness, and Margaret's head snapped to the side, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. Jake's paralysis broke. He dropped the knife, the clatter echoing as he charged at Claudia, a roar tearing from his throat. She swung the rifle toward him, but he was too close, too fast, slamming into her with the full weight of his body. They crashed to the floor, the gun skittering across the marble, and Jake's fists flew, driven by a fury he couldn't name. Grief for John, fear for his parents, hatred for the woman who'd turned his life to ash. Claudia clawed at him, nails raking his face, but he pinned her wrists, his knee pressing into her chest as he snarled, "Enough!" The crew hesitated, their masks turning toward the struggle, unsure whether to intervene. Marcus stepped forward, crowbar raised, but a shotgun blast from the hallway stopped him cold. Daniel had worked his ropes loose, years of training kicking in, and he'd grabbed a weapon from a hidden cache beneath the stairs. The blast caught Marcus in the leg, shredding muscle and bone, and he screamed, collapsing in a heap. The others scattered, panic overtaking greed as the sirens grew louder, closer. Jake didn't see it. His world narrowed to Claudia's thrashing form beneath him, her curses spitting through gritted teeth. She bucked, freeing an arm, and drove a fist into his jaw, stars exploding behind his eyes. He reeled, and she rolled free, scrambling for the rifle. But Daniel was there, shotgun steady in his hands, his voice a low growl. "Drop it or I drop you." Claudia froze, her hand inches from the gun, her grin fading as the reality sank in. The crew was gone, fled or bleeding out, and the police lights flashed through the windows, red and blue painting the walls. She raised her hands, slow and deliberate, her eyes darting between Daniel and Jake like a cornered animal. Jake stumbled to his feet, his face stinging, his gaze drawn to John's body. The blood had stopped spreading, a dark halo around him, his face slack in death. Regret clawed at Jake's chest, a jagged thing he couldn't swallow. He'd thrown the knife to stop him, not to kill him, but the line between intent and consequence had blurred in the chaos. John had betrayed him, brought this hell to his door, but beneath the anger, there was still the echo of what they'd been. Nights in the garage, stolen kisses, a bond he'd thought unbreakable. Daniel cut Margaret free, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed against his chest. The police breached the door, shouting commands, their boots pounding the floor. Claudia was cuffed, her defiance crumbling into silence as they dragged her away. Jake sank to his knees beside John, his hands hovering over the body, unsure what to touch, what to mourn. The mansion was a tomb now, its grandeur stained with blood and loss. The sirens faded, replaced by the murmur of officers and the rustle of evidence bags. Jake stayed there, staring at John's face, until Daniel's hand gripped his shoulder, heavy and firm. "He made his choice," his father said, voice rough but steady. "You didn't." Jake nodded, but the words felt hollow. He'd lost more than John tonight. He'd lost the part of himself that had believed in them. The knives, the blood, the screams, they'd carved that away, leaving a wound that wouldn't heal with time. Outside, the night settled, cold and unyielding, as the Sullivan estate stood silent, a monument to a family fractured beyond repair. 20-year-old Jake Sullivan moved through life like a shadow, lean and wiry, his frame honed by restless energy rather than discipline. His hazel eyes flickered between defiance and doubt, a kaleidoscope of emotions he could never quite pin down. Dark hair fell in messy waves over his forehead, a quiet rebellion against the military precision of his father, Daniel Sullivan, a retired Marine Corps sergeant whose buzz-cut and squared shoulders still screamed barracks life. 3 years ago, Daniel had struck gold with a $12 million lottery win, a windfall that transformed their modest ranch house on the outskirts of town into a gaudy fortress. Marble floors replaced worn linoleum, a home theater sprouted where the old living room had been, and the garage became a shrine to vintage cars, gleaming Mustangs and Corvettes that Daniel polished with the reverence of a man tending an altar. But wealth hadn't softened him. His worldview remained rigid, forged in the crucible of battlefields and boot camps, where survival meant strength, and strength meant conformity. Homosexuality to Daniel was a weakness, a betrayal of manhood, a stain on the honor he'd bled for. Jake knew the cost of truth, expulsion from the inheritance, the house, the life he'd always known. A life that, for all its new gloss, still felt like a cage. So he buried his desires deep, locking them away behind a mask of shrugs and half-smiles, until John Carter crashed into his world like a meteor through a quiet sky. John was a storm made flesh, broad-shouldered, with jet-black hair that fell into his eyes when he laughed, and a smirk that promised trouble as easily as it promised salvation. His skin bore the faint scars of a rough upbringing, pale lines crisscrossing his forearms, souvenirs of a childhood spent dodging fists and broken bottles in a trailer park 2 counties over. His knuckles were perpetually bruised from bar fights, the kind he picked not out of anger but out of boredom. A need to feel something sharp and real. Yet his touch was electric, a current that jolted Jake awake from a slumber he hadn't known he'd been in. They met at the Rusty Nail, a dive bar on the edge of town where the jukebox played songs a decade out of date, and the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and spilled beer. Jake had been nursing a lukewarm bottle of Budweiser, his third of the night, when John leaned over the pool table across the room, hips cocked, cue stick balanced lazily in his hands. Their eyes caught through the haze, John's green and piercing, Jake's hesitant but curious, and the world tilted just enough to matter. Words were few that night. A brush of hands as John passed him on the way to the bar sparked something primal, a heat that coiled low in Jake's gut. By midnight, they were tangled in the bed of John's beat-up pickup, parked behind a stand of pines off Route 17, windows fogging as their breaths synced to the slow, sultry croon of a country tune on the radio. Something about whiskey and regret that felt too close to home. Their love unfurled in secret, a fragile thing blooming in the cracks of a life Jake couldn't escape. Stolen kisses behind the gas station where Jake worked weekends, the taste of motor oil and John's cheap gum mingling on his tongue. Nights in John's cramped apartment above a pawn shop, the walls paper-thin and stained yellow from years of neglect, their bodies pressed close on a mattress that smelled of cigarettes and longing. John's hands were rough, calloused from odd jobs, welding, hauling scrap, whatever paid the rent, but they moved over Jake's skin with a tenderness that undid him, tracing the lines of his ribs, the hollow of his throat, as if mapping a territory he'd claimed. Jake felt alive under that touch, seen in a way he'd never been, his skin humming with a song he hadn't known he could sing. But the shadow of his father loomed ever larger, a specter in dress blues haunting every stolen moment. Daniel's voice echoed in Jake's skull, lectures about duty, about being a man, delivered over breakfasts of black coffee and eggs in the mansion's sterile kitchen. "You're my legacy, Jake," he'd say, eyes hard as flint. "Don't fuck it up." The unspoken threat hung heavy. Step out of line, and the marble floors, the cars, the cushioned life would vanish, leaving Jake with nothing but the clothes on his back and a name stripped of its weight. Weeks bled into months, their passion a tightrope stretched over an abyss that grew wider with every touch. Jake's heart warred with itself. John's laughter, a rough-edged melody that lit up the darkest corners of his soul, pitted against the cold reality of Daniel's wealth and wrath. John was a whirlwind, chaotic and free, everything Jake craved but couldn't hold. They'd lie awake after, sweat cooling on their skin, John's arms slung over Jake's chest, his breath warm against Jake's neck. "You ever think about it?" John would murmur, voice husky with sleep. "Just you and me, no bullshit, no hiding?" Jake would nod, a lie he told with his body, because thinking about it was all he did. Dreams of a life unshackled, tangled with the dread of what it would cost. He'd seen the way Daniel looked at men who didn't fit his mold, the sneer that curled his lip when the news ran stories about pride parades or protests. "Weak," he'd mutter, flipping the channel. "No spine." Jake knew that gaze would turn on him if the truth slipped out, and the thought of it, of losing the only family he had, flawed as it was, kept him tethered to silence. The tension built like a storm on the horizon, heavy and inevitable. One humid evening in late August, the air thick with the buzz of cicadas, Jake sprawled on John's couch, a thrift store relic, with springs that poke through the faded plaid. The window was cracked open, letting in the faint scent of rain and exhaust from the street below, but the heat clung to them anyway, a second skin. John knelt beside him, shirtless, his broad chest glistening with sweat as he traced lazy circles on Jake's sternum through his thin tank top. His lips brushed Jake's ear, a whisper that carried the weight of a dream. "We could run, you know, anywhere. Fuck this town, fuck the rules. Just us." His voice was soft but urgent, a plea wrapped in bravado, and for a moment, Jake let himself imagine it. A highway stretching endless before them, John's hand on his thigh, a life where he didn't have to flinch at every shadow. But the fantasy cracked under the weight of reality. Jake pulled away, sitting up, the couch creaking beneath him as he ran a hand through his damp hair. His voice came low, a confession he'd rehearsed in silence 100 times, each word a stone dropping into still water. I can't. If he finds out, I'm out, nothing left. No money, no house, no anything. We have to end this. The room went still, the hum of the cicadas outside the only sound as John's face darkened, a storm cloud rolling in over the green of his eyes. He stood, fists clenching at his sides, the muscles in his arms tensing like coiled wire. So you ditch me for his fucking money? He spat, the words sharp as broken glass. All this, us? It's just shit you can toss when it gets hard? Hurt crackled in the air between them, a live wire Jake couldn't touch without burning. John, it's not. Jake started, but the plea died in his throat. John's glare cut deeper than any argument could, a wound Jake had inflicted without meaning to. The air thickened with unspoken things, love twisted into anger, need warped by fear. And John turned, grabbing his jacket from the arm of the couch. Fuck you, Jake, he said, voice breaking on the edge of something raw, and stormed out, the door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the walls. Jake sat there, hollow, the echo of their love a bruise on his soul, spreading dark and deep. The apartment felt too small without John's presence, the silence suffocating, and Jake buried his face in his hands, the weight of his choice pressing down like a physical thing. Days blurred into a gray haze after that. Jake went through the motions, shifts at the gas station, dinners with Daniel where he nodded at the right times, nights staring at the ceiling of his two-big bedroom in the mansion, the hum of the air conditioner drowning out his thoughts. John didn't call, didn't show up at the bar, and the absence carved a hole in Jake's chest he couldn't fill. He'd see the pickup parked outside the pawn shop sometimes, rusted and still, and his fingers would itch to knock on John's door, to take it all back. But the fear held him fast. Daniel's shadow, the millions that dangled like a noose, the life he'd lose if he stepped over the line. He told himself it was better this way, safer, but the lie tasted bitter, and sleep came in fits, haunted by the memory of John's touch, the sound of his laugh. Meanwhile, John nursed his own wounds, the sting of Jake's rejection festering into something darker. He drank too much, picked fights with men twice his size, let the bruises bloom across his skin like a map of his anger. Jake had been his anchor, the one good thing in a life of sharp edges, and losing him felt like drowning. He'd meant it when he'd said they could run. He'd pictured it, a shitty apartment somewhere warm, Jake's head on his shoulder as the sun set over a horizon they'd chosen. But Jake had chosen money over him. Or so John told himself, and the betrayal fueled a reckless streak that burned brighter with every shot of whiskey. He didn't know then that it would lead him to Claudia, to the heist, to a night that would shatter everything. But that was a story still unwritten, a storm gathering strength beyond the horizon. For Jake, the mansion grew colder, its marble floors a mirror reflecting a life he didn't recognize. He'd saved himself from Daniel's wrath, kept the inheritance intact, but the cost was a piece of his soul, traded for a security that felt like chains. John's absence was a ghost in every room, a reminder of what he'd lost, and as summer faded into fall, Jake wondered if the tightrope he'd walked had snapped beneath him after all, leaving him falling with no one to catch him. John's rage found a vessel in Claudia Reyes, his oldest friend, a firecracker of a woman whose presence crackled like a live wire. At 21, Claudia was a force of nature, 5'4" of coiled muscle and sharp edges, her jet-black braids swinging like a pendulum down her back. Her rap sheet was longer than the Mississippi. Petty theft at 16, assault by 18, gang ties that landed her in county lockup twice before she could legally drink. Her arms were a canvas of ink, tattoos snaking from wrist to shoulder, a skull wreathed in roses, a dagger piercing a heart, the name Reyes in jagged script across her knuckles. Her eyes were sharp as broken glass, glinting with a mix of cunning and chaos, and when she smiled, it was a blade unsheathed, beautiful, and dangerous. They'd known each other since they were kids, two misfits scraping by in a trailer park where hope was a luxury neither could afford. She'd been the one to pull John out of his first bar fight, 16 and bloody-nosed, laughing as she dragged him behind a dumpster to dodge the cops. Now she was the spark he needed, the match to the gasoline pooling in his chest. They met at the Blue Moon Diner the night after Jake's rejection. A greasy spoon on the edge of town where the coffee tasted like tar and the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying flies. John slammed his mug down on the chipped formica table, dark liquid sloshing over the rim, his voice a low growl as he spilled his heartbreak. Jake's cowardice, the way he'd chosen Daniel's millions over him, the fortune dangling just out of reach like a carrot on a string. "He's too scared to fight for us," John said, fists clenching, knuckles whitening. "Threw me away like I was nothing, just to keep his daddy's money." His green eyes burned, wet with unshed tears he'd never let fall, and Claudia leaned in, her elbows on the table, her lips curling into a wicked grin that promised trouble. "Why wait for him to inherit?" she purred, voice low and smooth as velvet laced with venom. "Let's take it ourselves." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric, and John felt something feral ignite inside him. A heist, a middle finger to Jake's betrayal, a chance to claim what he'd been denied, to rip the Sullivan wealth from Daniel's hands and watch the old man choke on his pride. Claudia's eyes danced with mischief, her fingers drumming a staccato beat on the table, and John nodded, slow and deliberate, the ember of his anger flaring into a blaze. "Yeah," he said, voice rough with resolve. "Let's do it." The idea took root that night, a seed planted in the cracked soil of John's pain, and Claudia watered it with her own brand of madness. She roped in her crew over the next few days, hardened men with rifles and no qualms, faces John recognized from the underbelly of town. There was Marcus, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a scar splitting his left eyebrow, his hands steady on a shotgun. Rico, wiry and twitchy, a safe cracker with a cocaine habit and a grin like a jackal. And the twins, Leo and Vince, ex-cons with matching buzz cuts and a penchant for breaking bones. They were a pack of wolves, loyal to Claudia's charisma and the promise of cash, and John felt a strange thrill watching them fall into line, their voices a low hum of anticipation as they gathered around her like moths to a flame. The plan took shape over weeks, meticulous and mad, a tapestry woven from desperation and spite. Claudia scouted Daniel's mansion with the precision of a predator, staking out the property in a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. She noted the security cameras perched like vultures on the eaves, 4 in total, 2 at the front, 1 by the garage, 1 sweeping the back lawn. She clocked Daniel's habits. The old Marine was up at dawn, coffee in hand, patrolling the grounds with a soldier's gait. Evenings found him in his study, hunched over ledgers or polishing a revolver he kept in a locked drawer. The safe was the prize, rumored among the town's lowlifes to hold stacks of cash. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more, tucked behind a false panel in the study wall. Claudia had heard whispers of it from a fence who dealt with Daniel years back, and she'd confirmed it with a bribe to a maid who'd quit after a month of his barking orders. John sketched layouts from memory, his hands trembling as he traced the lines on yellow legal pads stolen from a gas station. The garage was the entry point, its side door unlocked half the time, a detail he'd learned from nights spent there with Jake, kissing in the shadows, the scent of motor oil and leather thick in the air. His pencil lingered over that spot, the graphite smudging under his thumb, and he could almost feel Jake's breath against his neck, the way his hands had gripped John's shirt like a lifeline. The kitchen came next, its back door a weak point, the lock rusted from disuse. Then the hallway to the study, lined with photos of Daniel in uniform, a shrine to a man who'd never bend. John's stomach twisted as he drew. The ache of losing Jake, a dull throb beneath his ribs, but he pushed it down, letting anger fuel him instead. He pictured confronting Daniel, forcing the old man to see the son he'd never truly known, the lover he'd never accept. Imagine the shock on that weathered face when John tore his world apart. The crew drilled their roles in abandoned warehouses on the edge of town, the kind of places where the wind whistled through broken windows and the floors were stained with oil and secrets. Voices hushed, rifles gleaming under flickering fluorescent lights. They ran through the plan like soldiers prepping for war. Marcus and the twins would handle entry, smashing through the garage with crowbars and brute force. Rico would crack the safe, his nimble fingers dancing over the dial. Claudia would take point, her rifle trained on Daniel, her voice a whip to keep the old man in line. John's job was intimidation. Wrench in hand, he'd back Claudia up, his presence a silent promise of violence if Daniel resisted. They practiced until the movements were muscle memory, the air thick with sweat and gunpowder, Claudia's laughter a siren call cutting through the tension. "We're gonna be legends," she'd say, clapping John on the shoulder, her grin wide and wild. "Sullivan won't know what hit him." John's resolve hardened with every meeting, his anger a fuel that burned hotter each day. He'd wake in his cramped apartment, the mattress still indented from where Jake used to lie, and channel the hurt into purpose. He'd pace the worn carpet, replaying Jake's words, "I can't. If he finds out, I'm out," and let them stoke the fire. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, about taking back what Jake had surrendered, about proving he wasn't disposable. Claudia fed that fire, her confidence a drug he couldn't quit. She'd sit cross-legged on a crate in the warehouse, cleaning her rifle with a rag, her voice low as she painted the future. "We'll split the cash, ditch this shithole town, Mexico maybe, or Cali. You and me, Johnny, living like kings." Her eyes would lock on his, daring him to doubt her, and he'd nod, caught in her orbit, the sting of Jake's rejection dulled by the promise of revenge. Yet, in quiet moments, when the crew dispersed and the warehouse stood empty, John's mind drifted to Jake despite himself. He'd lean against a rusted beam, the cold metal biting into his back, and see Jake's face. Those hazel eyes fluttering shut in surrender, the soft gasps that escaped him when John kissed the hollow of his throat. He'd remember the nights they'd spent tangled together, the radio playing low, the world shrinking to the space between their bodies. Jake had been his anchor, the one good thing in a life of jagged edges, and losing him had left a hole John couldn't fill with rage or cash. He'd light a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals, and wonder if Jake felt it too, the hollow ache, the ghost of what they'd been. The betrayal stung anew each time, a knife twisting in his gut, but beneath it was a flicker of something softer, a longing he couldn't snuff out. Claudia noticed, of course. She always did. One night, as they sat in her sedan outside the Sullivan estate, the mansion's lights glowing gold against the dusk, she nudged him with her elbow. "You're still mooning over him, huh?" she said, her tone teasing but sharp. John scowled, flicking ash out the window. "Fuck off, Claude." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and leaned closer, her braid brushing his arm. "He's a coward, Johnny. Let him rot with his daddy's money. We're better than that." Her words were a lifeline, and John clung to them, shoving Jake's memory back into the shadows where it belonged. The plan neared its tipping point, the crew restless, the air thick with anticipation. They'd set the date, Friday, 3 nights from now, when Daniel's routine left him alone in the study, Margaret out at her weekly book club. John sharpened his wrench with a whetstone stolen from a hardware store, the scrape of metal on stone a rhythm that steadied his nerves. He imagined the weight of it in his hand, the look on Daniel's face when the garage door caved in, the chaos that would follow. Claudia ran the crew through one last rehearsal, her voice a whip cracking over their heads, and John felt the pull of it. The rush of power, the thrill of rebellion. He was in too deep to turn back, the heist a freight train barreling toward a cliff, and he was strapped to the front. But that night, alone in his apartment, the cigarette burned to a stub between his fingers. John stared at the ceiling and saw Jake's face again. The anger was still there, a live coal in his chest, but so was the ache, a bruise that wouldn't fade. He'd lost Jake to Daniel's world, and now he'd take that world apart, piece by piece. Whether it was revenge or redemption, he couldn't say, but as the clock ticked toward Friday, John knew one thing. The Sullivan mansion wouldn't be the only thing left in ruins. The aftermath was a blur of grief and justice, a storm that swept through the Sullivan mansion and left only wreckage in its wake. Police stormed the gaudy fortress in the pre-dawn hours, their boots pounding the marble floors as flashlights cut through the haze of gun smoke and shattered lives. Daniel and Linda Sullivan were freed from their bindings, Daniel's wrists raw and bruised, Linda trembling as she clutched her husband's arm, mascara streaking her face like war paint. Claudia Reyes was apprehended blocks away, her jet-black braids swinging as she tried to ditch her rifle in a rusted dumpster behind a gas station. She'd cursed and spat as the cuffs snapped shut, her sharp eyes blazing with defiance, even as the weight of her crime settled around her like chains. John's body lay cold in the study, sprawled across the blood-soaked rug, identified by the tattoos snaking over his arms, a dagger on his forearm, a rose on his bicep. His death ruled a casualty of the heist gone wrong, a footnote in the chaos. The coroner zipped him into a black bag as the first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows, painting the scene in shades of gray and regret. Daniel raged to the investigators, his voice a marine's bellow as he paced the ruined hall, blaming thugs and low-life scum for the invasion, never suspecting Jake's role in the spiral that had led to this night. His fists clenched, veins bulging beneath weathered skin, he recounted the gunfire, the threats, the moment he'd stared down Claudia's rifle barrel, details sharp and vivid, a soldier's report. Linda wept beside him, her sobs muffled by a handkerchief as she clutched a framed photo of Jake taken years before. A teenage boy with messy dark hair and a hesitant smile, oblivious to the fractures forming beneath their gilded life. The police scribbled notes, their radios crackling with updates. But Jake was nowhere to be found, no trace, no word, a ghost who'd slipped through the cracks of the chaos. His bike, a beat-up Yamaha he'd ridden into the night, was discovered abandoned miles away on a dirt road flanked by pines, its engine cold, its tank half full, as if he'd simply walked away from it. And, from them all, his name became a whisper in town, a rumor carried on bar stools and grocery aisles. Jake Sullivan ran off after the heist. Crazy, right? Probably dead somewhere. Claudia took the fall, her trial a swift and brutal reckoning. Convicted of murder, armed robbery, and a laundry list of lesser charges, she stood unbowed in the courtroom, her lips curled in a sneer as the judge's gavel fell. The prosecution painted her as the mastermind, a feral creature who'd orchestrated the bloodshed, and the jury swallowed it whole. 12 townsfolk eager to pin the nightmare on a tattooed outsider. She was sentenced to life without parole, her defiance unyielding even in cuffs as she was led away, her voice echoing down the hall. You'll all choke on your secrets someday. The money, half recovered in a duffel bag stashed in the garage, half lost to the wind when the crew scattered, mattered little to a family fractured beyond repair. Daniel sank into his wealth, turning the mansion into a fortress of silence, while Linda faded into grief, her days spent staring at that photo, her nights haunted by the echo of sirens. 20 years crept by, a slow bleed of time that carved its mark on the world Jake had fled. He drifted through cities like a specter, his youth eroded by guilt and loss, his once wiry frame thinning to a gaunt shadow of itself. His dark hair grayed at the temples, then spread like frost across his scalp, and his hazel eyes, once flickering with defiance and doubt, grew hollow, haunted by a past he couldn't outrun. He'd bounced from job to job, city to city, mechanic in Tulsa, dishwasher in Reno, night watchman in a Portland warehouse. Each gig a temporary tether to a life he barely lived. His hands, still stained with the faint memory of motor oil, trembled now. Not from passion, but from too many nights with a bottle, too many mornings waking to the same ache. John's face never faded from his mind, those dark green eyes sharp and alive, that final kiss in the garage, fierce and desperate, the blood blooming on his shirt, a stain Jake had put there with a knife thrown in panic. The guilt was a weight he carried everywhere, a stone lodged in his chest, growing heavier with each passing year. He'd tried to forget, to bury John in the wreckage of that night, but memory was a relentless ghost. In Tulsa, he'd wake from dreams of John's laugh, rough and warm, only to find the motel room empty, the sheets cold. In Reno, he'd see a broad-shouldered man leaning over a pool table and freeze, heart pounding, until the stranger turned and the face was wrong. In Portland, he'd sit on the docks at night, the Columbia River lapping dark and silent, and replay the moment he'd chosen wealth over love. John's voice, raw with hurt, spitting, "So you ditch me for his fucking money?" And lost everything in the bargain. He'd abandoned the inheritance anyway, fleeing the mansion and the life it promised. But the cost had been steeper than Daniel's wrath. It was John's life, snuffed out in a hail of bullets, and Jake's soul, hollowed out by the what-ifs that gnawed at him like rats. On a crisp autumn day in late October, 20 years to the month since that night, Jake returned to the town he'd fled, drawn by a pull he couldn't name. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, the sky a pale blue streaked with clouds like brushstrokes. He drove a rusted Chevy he'd bought for cash in Boise, its engine rattling as he rolled past the outskirts. Past the Rusty Nail, its neon sign flickering weakly. Past the gas station where he'd once kissed John behind the pumps. Past the turnoff to the Sullivan estate, now a shadow of its former glory, its marble facade cracked, its windows dark. He didn't stop there. His destination was quieter, older. The cemetery on the hill overlooking town, a sprawl of headstones nestled among oaks and maples, their leaves a riot of red and gold. John's grave was modest, tucked in a corner near a crumbling stone wall, the earth settled and weathered by 2 decades of rain and frost. The headstone was simple granite, the name John Carter etched in block letters, the dates beneath, born 1994, died 2005, stark and final. Wilted flowers lay at its base, their petals browned and curling, left by someone who still remembered. Jake parked the Chevy at the gate and walked the winding path, his boots crunching gravel, his breath fogging in the chill. He knelt before the stone, his knees sinking into the damp grass, and his fingers traced the letters of John's name, the grooves rough under his calloused skin. A sob broke free, raw and unbidden, as memories flooded him. Nights of passion in John's pickup, the windows steaming as their bodies pressed close. Days of secrets, stolen glances over beers in the garage. The moment he'd pulled away on that humid evening, choosing Daniel's world over John's, and set the dominoes falling toward that bloody night. He didn't hear the footsteps at first, lost in the tide of grief, but a shadow fell over him, long and thin against the stone. He looked up, blinking through tears, to see an old woman, frail and bent, her face a map of sorrow carved by time. Her once dark hair was now silver, pulled into a loose bun, and her eyes, green like John's, though sunken and dull by decades of tears, stared down at him. It was Mary Carter, John's mother, her frame shrunken beneath a wool coat too big for her hands clutching a cane for support. She'd been a shadow in John's life back then, a woman worn down by a husband who'd left and a son who'd inherited his wildness. But Jake remembered her quiet voice, her weary smile when he'd lingered at their trailer after school. Recognition dawned in her gaze, slow and painful, and her lips parted, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "You're him, Jake." He nodded, throat tight, unable to speak as she studied him. The gray hair, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the man he'd become. Her mouth trembled, and she stepped closer, the cane tapping the ground. "You could have just told us," she said, her words heavy with despair, a quiet accusation that stripped him bare. The simplicity of it, the truth he'd never faced, cut deeper than any knife, slicing through the layers of guilt and denial he'd built over 20 years. She didn't mean Daniel, not really. She meant her, John, the life they could have had if he'd been brave enough to claim it. Jake's mouth opened, a defense rising instinctively. "I couldn't. You don't understand, I was scared." But no words came, only silence, thick with regret. He'd had 1,000 chances to tell John, to tell Mary, to stand up and say, "This is who I am, this is who I love," but he'd chosen the shadows instead, and the cost was written in the stone before him. Mary's eyes held his for a moment longer, searching for something he couldn't give, then turned away, her cane clicking as she hobbled back to a faded sedan parked near the gate. She didn't look back, her silhouette shrinking against the horizon, leaving Jake alone with the grave. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, a mournful elegy that carried the weight of his failures. He pressed his palm flat against the headstone, the cold seeping into his skin, and whispered, "I'm sorry." The words too late, too small. The town sprawled below, a patchwork of rooftops and memories, but it wasn't home anymore. It hadn't been since John died. Jake stood, his knees creaking, and walked back to the Chevy, the grave a fixed point behind him, a tether to a love betrayed and a life undone. He drove away as the sun dipped low, the road stretching into dusk, carrying him toward a future he'd stopped imagining long ago.